Hello. Up until the last session, I shared my experiences regarding my child's time in kindergarten, elementary school, and middle and high school. Starting today, I will be talking about preparing for adulthood. I began preparing my child for adulthood in 2012 when my child was in 10th grade. At first, when I tried to prepare my child for adulthood, I felt overwhelmed and didn't know where to start. I think other parents probably feel the same way as I did. You know you need to prepare for something, but you don't know what to prepare. And since you don't even know what you don't know who to ask or what to ask about. At that time, the very first thing I did was to look for an expert who could help my child prepare for adulthood because I didn't know much myself. That's when I found out about a tool called PATH. So I contacted several organizations to try to find a PATH expert. Looking back now, I think the agency we mostly contacted at that time was CLBC, but the answer we consistently got was that they couldn't help us without a referral. And although they said there were PATH experts, in reality, there were hardly any. Now I completely understand why we got those responses. Now that I understand the system a bit, but at the time I remember feeling really frustrated because I couldn't find anyone or any organization that could help. So in the end, I decided to do it myself, searching the internet, visiting various organizations to gather information, and that's how I ended up making a transition plan for my child's adulthood. I mentioned before that it took about 6 months to complete, back in the day. And just because you've made a plan once doesn't mean it's over. You have to keep reviewing the plan, making changes and improvements as needed, and continuously updating it. That just shows how much time and effort is required. Additionally, one more piece of information I'd like to share is that although it didn't exist back in 2012, a navigator service called STAR, provided by an organization called MCFD, was introduced later on. STAR stands for Service to Adults with Developmental Disabilities, and it is a government agency service that helps individuals with developmental disabilities between the ages of 16 and 24 to establish a transition plan into adulthood. You can now access this service, so if you are interested, please contact to apply. Now from this point on, I will explain what an adulthood transition plan is, why it is necessary, and how to prepare for it. First, an adulthood transition plan is about planning ahead for a better future. It involves setting dreams and goals and making plans on how to achieve those goals. It means planning important decisions about the future, such as where and how you will live, your education, career, finances, and how you will participate in society. Why is this important? Just as we need a map to reach our destination, our children also need a plan for their future in order to achieve their goals. While most children can set their own goals or figure out what they need to do as situations arise, our children find it difficult to anticipate and prepare in advance. That's why parents and those around them need to help set these goals and create an environment that supports achieving them. So this becomes an opportunity to review your child's current situation and to create a vision for their future. And because it takes enough time to prepare and carry out this plan, it's important to secure that time in advance. How should you prepare? First, let me share a few key points. First of all, start planning as early as possible. We hold workshops on transition planning for adulthood, and usually ages 15, 14, or 16 are the most suitable times to start such planning. However, sometimes parents of children in the first or second grade of elementary school also attend the seminars. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The reason is that you are making 5-year, 10-year, or 15-year plans for your child in advance. So it's best to start as early as possible, even if your child is in their 20s or 30s. I think it's fine to do it if necessary. And this should be person-centered. In other words, it should be a plan centered on your child. So since you are planning your child's future, it should be child-centered, not parent-centered. Naturally, that means you should focus on their strengths, because our children tend to have many shortcomings. Parents usually focus on fixing those weaknesses. But rather than that, it's important to focus on what your child likes and does well, and to support them in those areas. And you need to have faith. In other words, you need to believe that your child has talents and strengths, can express what they want, and has the ability to contribute to society. This kind of belief is also necessary. In other words, you need to have faith to see your child in as positive as possible, rather than focusing on the negatives. So as I mentioned earlier, the focus shouldn't be on fixing your child, but on how to support their dreams and strengths. To do that, you need to be well informed about the various programs around you, as well as government policies and services. Later, after this transition plan is over, I will explain the various government support systems, but you need to have all the information about those as well. And rather than doing it alone as a parent, it's important to make use of various resources such as friends, neighbors, and the community around you. Now, I will explain in detail how to establish a transition plan for adulthood. First of all, there are several tools available, but the tool I used is called PATH. PATH stands for planning, alternative, tomorrows with hope, and it is a method where you set future goals and then plan backwards, step by step, from the future to the present to determine how to achieve those goals. In other words, you first set your future plans, then return to the present to identify any gaps that exist until you achieve those goals and establish how you will accomplish them step by step. And the material I referred to at the time was a resource called Your Future Now, published by an organization called MCFT. I used this by gradually modifying the worksheet in my own way. Since today is a time to give you an overview, I will first show you the big picture and then explain each step, one by one. First of all, before doing this, a team needs to be formed. When we talk about a team, it can include parents and school teachers, and you can utilize all available resources, whether it's a BCBA, neighbors, or friends. However, since many Koreans don't have a lot of people around them, in the end, it's usually the parents who have to take on this role. And even if there is help from others, there are limitations. So ultimately, it has to be the parents who take the lead. When I was going through this, I hoped that an expert would guide me, but it was hard to find such an expert. And even if you do, they can't stay involved for a long time. They can briefly explain the framework and help set the basic direction, but it's difficult for them to continuously establish and manage this plan. I usually run a workshop with other parents for about 6 weeks. With this topic, as I'll explain later, we use various methods to fill out different worksheets. What I can do is explain that kind of framework and offer a few comments. But in the end, since parents know their children best, it seems that parents have no choice but to take the lead. Now let me explain a few steps. First, step 1, creating a personal profile. This involves writing down detailed information about your child. Surprisingly, although parents seem to know their children well, when they actually try to fill this out, they often realize, oh, I don't know as much about my child as I thought. This comes up in worksheet 1. Second, as shown in the vision creation worksheet 2, you imagine what a week in your child's future might look like. Third, setting goals is covered in worksheet 3. Next, compare the current situation with your future goals and conduct a gap analysis. Then, in worksheet 5, you analyze how to acquire the necessary competencies, and in worksheet 6, you set important goal milestones for each phase or stage. And as the 7th step, you create a detailed action plan for the first phase. 8th, you regularly review the plans you have set, making revisions and improvements as needed. Let me show you a diagram. This is something we also use at Hunin House. If you look here, number 1 is about creating a profile. This is the now stage. Next, if you move forward, you'll see a section labeled 2. There, under Vision for Good Life, as I mentioned earlier, you write your vision clearly in one sentence, and then you describe how your child spends their week. And third, it's very important to set priorities for each category next to it. So you determine goal 1, 2, and 3. After that, you return to the present and conduct the 4th step, which is a gap analysis. You look at the current situation, the future goals, and figure out what is needed to bridge the gap. So if you look there, it says build strengths. So we realize there are certain things that we need to prepare. You write down the necessary competencies there. And then if you look there, phase 3 is marked as number 6. You work your way down, step by step, from the distant future. So phase 3 becomes number 6, phase 2 is number 7, and phase 1 is number 8. That means phase 2 and 3 will be defined somewhat broadly, relatively speaking, at least from the perspective of the current situation. So the most important thing right now is to eventually become phase 1s. You write down the sub-goals for what you want to achieve within the next year or the next 3 years. And then for that phase 1, you create a very detailed action plan. But to make this detailed action plan, you can't just sit at your desk. As I mentioned earlier, you need to look into what kinds of government support services are available, and you may also need to seek out experts to secure the necessary capabilities. And if you plan to go to a school or get a job, you should also research the schools you're interested in. So you might visit schools, or if you're interested in a particular workplace, you could look into that company as well. This is a period where you need to actively get out there and do the legwork. Once you've done that and come up with an action plan, there will be parts of the plan that you need to work on at home. And there will also be action items that require collaboration with other organizations. As you can see here, it says Here and Now Day program. If you participate in the Here and Now Day program, you'll separate and write down the action plans you'll do at home and those you'll carry out within the Here and Now Day program. If you're not participating in the Here and Now program, but working with another specialist, then you'll need an action plan to carry out with that specialist. For example, in our case, if a tutor is needed, finding an art tutor or a music tutor would become part of the action plan. And then, as you continue carrying out these steps, you'll see that there's a regular review, and then you receive feedback and reflect that feedback back into the plan. In this way, the transition plan for adulthood is established and continuously updated. All right, we'll stop here for now. Starting next time, I will go over each worksheet in detail, explaining them with various examples. As I briefly mentioned earlier, we run a 6-week workshop called A Life We Walk Together. Usually we hold small group workshops with about 5 families, and the reason for this is that each week participants bring their completed worksheets to share and discuss with the group members. By listening to each other's thoughts and exchanging ideas, it becomes a great opportunity to gain various insights, which is why we conduct the workshop in this way. Although we can't do it that way here, I encourage you to follow along with this video and fill out the worksheet yourself. As you do so, you'll naturally be able to develop a transition plan for your child into adulthood. Thank you for watching up to this point. I'll see you next time. Thank you.